He walked away the night she needed him most, but fate brought him back to the woman he broke and the son he never knew. Now, standing in the rain with a ring in his hand, he's begging for a second chance. But will love forgive what pride destroyed? Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories. Hello, my beautiful family. How are you all? Are you enjoying these stories or not? Tell me. And also, where are you listening from today? May your hearts be filled with love, your homes with peace, and your lives with endless blessings. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Like, share with your loved ones, and help this family grow even bigger. Now, grab your heart, because this story will take you deep into love, pain, and second chances. Let's dive in. The night Mr. Hope walked out of her life was the kind of night that made the sky cry for the things human hearts couldn't say aloud. Rain crashed against the tall glass walls of their mansion like desperate hands begging to be let in, every drop echoing the ache building inside Raina's chest. The soft golden light in the hallway shimmered through the storm, but it felt too warm for a love that had already gone cold. She stood barefoot on the marble floor, wrapped in a silk gown that still carried the faint scent of his cologne from the night before, and for a split second, she almost believed this moment would melt back into the tenderness they once shared. But his back was already turned to her, straight and unmoving, like a man who had practiced walking away long before tonight. The pen lay where he had dropped it, its ink still fresh on the crisp white pages of the divorce papers resting on the mahogany table. Not just paper, but a silent witness to a love story that had been rewritten without her consent. His hand, once the one that pulled her close in the dark, now left nothing behind except the signature that severed the bond they had sworn would last forever. Raina's eyes trailed over his neat signature like it might reveal a reason, a hesitation, anything that proved their love hadn't been a lie. But there was no hesitation in his strokes. There was no softness, just finality. He adjusted the sleeve of his suit with calculated grace, every movement so precise it almost hurt to watch. This was the same man who used to fumble with her necklaces in the mornings, laugh against her skin when she told him he was too serious. Now, even the sound of his breathing felt foreign, like a stranger had taken the place of the man she loved. "It's for the best," he had said earlier, with that controlled tone that made her feel like she was part of a transaction, not a heartbreak. For the best for who? She wanted to scream. But her voice, always so full of strength, trembled somewhere deep inside, tangled with the sound of the rain. He walked toward the door with his umbrella already in his hand. He didn't glance back at the staircase where she had once rushed down into his arms. He didn't look at the hallway where he had whispered promises against her neck. He didn't look at her at all. The only sound was the steady tap of his shoes on marble and the relentless storm outside. Raina's chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths as she took a small step forward, hoping, praying that maybe he'd pause, maybe his shoulders would tense, maybe he'd turn around at the last second and say her name like he used to, soft, warm, almost reverent. But his back remained a wall. The door opened, the cold wind slapped across her face, and then it closed. He was gone. For a moment, the entire house seemed to exhale a soundless sigh. A space once filled with shared laughter, whispered conversations, and midnight confessions now felt like a hollow museum of memories. The thunder rolled low and slow, like the world itself was mourning with her. Raina reached for the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against the cool wood, trying to anchor herself to something solid before the pain inside ripped her apart. She turned her head toward the door, half expecting it to swing back open, half expecting him to come running in, breathless, saying it was all a mistake. But the storm only grew louder, mocking her hope. She sank slowly to the floor, silk pooling around her like spilled moonlight. Her shaking hands came to rest against her still flat belly, an instinctive gesture she hadn't realized she'd been doing every night since she first suspected. The world thought she was alone, but she wasn't. Not entirely. Under her trembling palm, a new story was beginning. A secret heartbeat hidden in the silence of betrayal. Her breath caught as she whispered, "I'll protect you, little one, even if he won't." The words were a promise, a prayer, and a battle cry wrapped into one. She had spent years loving a man who built empires with his hands and burned hearts with the same ease, but this quiet heartbeat, this was hers. No contracts, no signatures, no walking away. She tilted her head back against the wall, the chandelier above her shimmering faintly through her tears. The ring on her finger caught the light for one last time, a perfect golden circle mocking the shattered vows it once symbolized. She lifted her hand slowly, every muscle trembling, and slid the ring off. It made the faintest sound when it landed on the floor, a sound so small and soft it should have meant nothing. But to her, it was the loudest goodbye. She stared at the ring, but it blurred through the water in her eyes. For the first time she realized he wasn't coming back. The thunder cracked again, shaking the house as if trying to wake her from a nightmare. She closed her eyes, letting the sound drown out the silence between her ribs. Memories attacked her in waves. His warm hands on her waist, the first night in this house, the way he whispered that she was his forever. She had believed him then. She had built her dreams on that promise. And now she was kneeling on the same floor, surrounded by broken echoes. The scent of him still clung to everything. The hallway, the silk gown, the table where they once shared late-night meals when the world outside was too loud. His cologne lingered in the air like a ghost refusing to leave, wrapping around her, both comforting and cruel. She pressed a fist against her chest as if she could hold herself together with sheer force. For a heartbeat, she thought she heard his footsteps again, but when she looked up, it was just the rain. The storm outside raged as if reflecting the chaos inside her soul. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the empty doorway. The empire he built would keep shining in the city lights. But she would be the one walking through the quiet fire of rebuilding her life from ashes. He had walked away with power, with confidence, with his umbrella shielding him from the rain. She remained barefoot, drenched in the storm he left behind. Her trembling fingers brushed the hem of her gown as her other hand returned protectively to her belly. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even have a plan. All she had was a tiny heartbeat that would soon become louder than her pain. She whispered into the empty hallway, "You'll know love, my baby." Even if it's only mine, to give the chandelier above flickered as if the house itself was listening. She pressed her cheek against the cold wall, feeling it ground her as the storm continued its relentless cry. Every second stretched into forever. Her body ached with the weight of what was lost, but deep beneath the ache, something new stirred, not just a child, but a flicker of strength that refused to die. Outside, lightning lit up the sky, and in the quiet between thunderclaps, she could swear she felt it, a pulse, tiny and determined, echoing beneath her skin. Raina inhaled shakily, tasting the salt of her tears, and closed her eyes. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the one she would protect with everything in her. She wasn't just the woman he left behind. She was the woman who would rise in silence, carrying the kind of love he'd never understand. As the night grew heavier, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She let the storm scream for her, and beneath the thunder, in the quietest corner of her soul, a tiny heartbeat answered, steady, fierce, alive. 2. The night the thunder whispered against her trembling skin was the last night Raina allowed herself to be broken. By the time dawn painted the sky in quiet streaks of silver, the mansion that once echoed with her laughter had turned into a ghost of a memory she would no longer live inside. She packed not with haste, but with a strange, heavy calm, that only comes when your soul has already decided to survive. Every folded dress, every carefully tucked memory into a box felt like peeling a layer of herself away. And yet beneath all that pain, a quiet fire was growing, small but steady. She placed a hand against her belly, feeling the faint rhythm beneath her palm. That heartbeat was the only sound that mattered now. The city, with all its noise, glitter, and whispers of his name, became something she could no longer breathe in. The skyscrapers that once symbolized their dreams now stood like silent witnesses to betrayal. She walked through the empty lobby with a single suitcase in hand, her steps echoing in the hollow space like the last beat of a chapter. No driver, no goodbyes, just her and the rain. She pulled the hood of her coat up, letting the cold air sting her cheeks because pain meant she was still alive. For a moment, as she glanced back at the towering mansion through the misty rain, she thought she saw a shadow standing by the window, but when she blinked, it was gone. She arrived at the quiet coastal town 2 hours before sunrise. The sky hung heavy with mist, and the ocean stretched endlessly, its waves humming a lullaby that wrapped around her tired heart like a soft blanket. The cottage she rented wasn't big, but it was hers, untouched by broken promises, untouched by his scent, untouched by the world that had turned its back. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath her boots, and when she pushed the door open, a rush of cool air welcomed her, like the sea itself was telling her she could start over here. She left her suitcase near the doorway and stood in the middle of the room for a long time. No marble floors, no chandeliers, no expensive silence. Just the soft whistle of the wind slipping through the cracked windows and the distant sound of the ocean kissing the shore. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace. She pressed both hands against her belly and whispered, "This is where we begin, little one." A sudden gust of wind pushed the door open wider, as if something, or someone, unseen, had followed her inside. Her heart raced for a heartbeat before the wind died down, leaving only silence. The days slipped by softly, like pages in a book she had finally decided to write for herself. She woke up to seagulls instead of business calls. She spent mornings wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching the ocean waves curl and crash against the rocks. At first, the silence terrified her. After years of living in a world filled with his voice, his footsteps, his cold presence, silence felt like a void. But slowly, that void began to fill with something new, strength. She started humming to her belly without realizing it. Simple lullabies, soft and warm, the kind her mother used to sing to her when the world felt too heavy. The tiny life growing inside her became her anchor. When fear whispered at night, fear of doing this alone, fear of the world judging, fear of the unknown, the heartbeat beneath her hand whispered louder, "You are not alone." One night, as she lay half asleep, she felt the faintest flutter deep inside her, a whisper of movement that made her sit up in the dark. Her breath caught. Her baby had just moved for the first time. The coastal town began to weave itself into her story. The old lady at the bakery who always saved her the freshest bread. The little boy who ran past her gate every morning with his kite, laughing like the world was made of endless skies. The wind that carried the scent of salt and hope. Raina found herself walking along the shore with her growing belly, her hair dancing wildly in the breeze. Strangers greeted her with soft smiles, not with whispers or pity. No one here knew her as Mrs. Hope. She was just Raina, a woman with storms behind her and sunlight somewhere ahead. Meanwhile, miles away in a penthouse overlooking the city, Mr. Hope was burying himself in meetings, investments, and sterile hotel rooms. The world saw a man at the height of his power, sharper, colder, untouchable. But the silence that filled his nights was deafening. It had no edges, no comfort. It stretched out like a punishment. He tried to silence it with numbers and signatures, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the way her hair fell against her shoulders, the way her laugh wrapped around him like a promise he never kept. He told himself he had moved on. He told the world he was fine, but every corner of his home still smelled faintly of her perfume. One night, sitting alone with a drink untouched in his hand, he caught himself saying her name out loud, and the sound of it made his chest ache. Back in the coastal cottage, Raina grew stronger with each passing day. Her reflection in the mirror changed. Her body was softer, fuller, glowing in ways she hadn't seen before. Her smile wasn't forced anymore. Her hands cradled her belly with a love so fierce it burned through the fear. She whispered stories to her unborn child, stories not of the past, but of the world she would build for him. A world where love wasn't begged for, a world where a mother's heart was enough. At night, she'd light a small candle by the window and sit wrapped in a shawl, listening to the rain tapping gently against the glass. The rain no longer reminded her of him walking away. It reminded her of the night she discovered her own strength. Sometimes, though, in the quietest hours, his face still flickered in her mind. Not as the man she loved, but as the man who left. A shadow, a lesson, a scar that no longer bled. On one such night, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her lower abdomen. Brief, but enough to make her grip the armrest. Her heart stuttered. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Not yet. Please, not yet." The months stretched on like threads of gold and pain intertwined. Her belly grew round and full, a living reminder of the love she once had and the love she now carried alone. She decorated the nursery with her own hands, soft blankets, painted stars, warm little socks folded neatly in drawers. Every brushstroke on the walls, every lullaby she hummed was a promise carved into time. He would know love, even if it came from one heart. A letter arrived one afternoon with no return address. She turned it over in her hands, her heart pounding, recognizing his handwriting in an instant. But she didn't open it. The world outside moved on without them, but inside that small house by the sea, a new world was blooming, fragile, yet unshakable. Raina didn't need the city anymore. She didn't need his name to feel whole. She had something stronger beneath her skin now, a heartbeat that belonged to her. The night grew darker than usual. The waves crashed harder against the rocks, and the air carried the smell of rain. She stood by the window, one hand on her back, the other on her swollen belly. Something felt different. The first drop of rain hit the window like a whispered warning, then another, then a chorus. The storm had returned, fierce and wild. But this time, she wasn't the woman kneeling on the floor begging for someone to stay. She was the woman standing tall, waiting to protect the life inside her. But as lightning streaked across the sky, a sudden warmth spread down her legs. She froze, her breath caught. It was too soon. It couldn't be now. The sound of thunder roared through the house as her knees weakened. "No, no, not now," she whispered, but the wetness on the floor told a different story. The storm outside grew louder, matching the storm rising inside her. Her water had broken. Alone, in a small cottage miles away from the world she left behind, she grabbed the edge of the table, her heart racing like a drumbeat. The tiny heartbeat inside her thudded in rhythm, as if reminding her they weren't alone. She straightened her spine, wiped her tears, and took one shaky breath after another. The rain slammed against the glass, thunder split the sky open, and in that fierce, wild night, Raina's water broke earlier than expected. The storm outside was raging like the night he walked away, but this time the thunder wasn't just echoing through empty halls. It was racing through his veins as his phone vibrated on the polished conference table. Mr. Hope had been sitting at the head of the long glass table, surrounded by men in tailored suits who waited for his approval on deals worth millions, but none of those numbers meant anything when the unfamiliar number blinked on the screen. He hesitated for just a second, his thumb hovering, but something in his chest tightened with a fear he hadn't felt in months. "Hello?" he answered, his voice low, expecting another late-night transaction. But the voice that came through sliced the air around him like a blade. "Sir, it's about Raina. She's in labor. Alone." For a heartbeat, the world froze. The murmurs in the boardroom faded into static. His hand clenched the phone tighter, knuckles whitening as if trying to hold on to something already slipping through. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His chair scraped against the marble floor as he stood, every muscle in his body trembling with 1,000 unspoken memories. Raina, labor, alone. The words burned into his skull. The rain outside blurred the city's skyline, turning the glowing skyscrapers into streaks of light as he ran through the lobby of the building like a man who'd been running his whole life, but never this fast. His driver tried to follow, umbrella in hand, but Mr. Hope didn't care about the storm. He threw himself into the back seat of the car, his heart pounding too loud to hear anything else. "To the hospital!" he barked, but his voice cracked in the middle, betraying the storm inside him. The driver sped through the slick streets, tires slicing through puddles as city lights reflected in the rain like ghosts of their past. Raina's face kept flashing in his mind. The way she looked at him the night he left, her eyes burning with silent pain. He'd told himself it was necessary, that he was protecting her from his world, from the weight of his empire, but deep down he knew he'd walked away from the only thing that ever made him feel human. Inside the car, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He pressed his palm against his chest like he could physically hold his heart together. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, though he didn't know if it was to God, to the universe, or to the woman he'd broken. Every red light felt like a punch, every second a reminder of how easily everything could be taken away. His mind replayed every night she fell asleep beside him, every morning she smiled through tired eyes, every whispered dream they once shared about building a future together. He had built empires out of ambition, but he had burned their love with the same fire. By the time the car screeched to a stop in front of the hospital, his breath was shallow, his tailored suit clinging to him from the rain he hadn't even realized was soaking him. He burst through the hospital doors, ignoring the security guard calling after him, his shoes leaving streaks of water on the polished floors. "Raina Hope," he said breathlessly to the nurse at the reception, his voice cracking on her name. "She's in labor. Where is she?" The nurse's eyes softened at the sight of this powerful man, soaked and wild-eyed like a boy who'd lost everything. "Room 302, she said, pointing down the corridor. He didn't wait to thank her. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing above him, each step pulling him closer to the woman he thought he'd lost forever. When he pushed the door open, the world stopped moving. The beeping of monitors, the soft cry of a newborn, the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something warmer, something alive, wrapped around him like a wave he couldn't fight. Raina lay in the hospital bed, her skin pale from the pain, but glowing with something deeper, something fierce. Her dark curls clung to her damp forehead, and her silk nightgown had been replaced by the hospital's plain fabric, but to him she had never looked more radiant. In her arms, swaddled in a small white blanket, was a tiny baby boy with skin soft like dusk and lashes that kissed his cheeks. For a moment Mr. Hope couldn't breathe. It wasn't just a baby, it was his son. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and the air between them thickened like the weight of all the nights they spent apart. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. The silence spoke for her, screamed for her. Her lips trembled, but her voice came out steady and cold. "You don't get to look at me like that." Her words were a knife, sharp and honest, slicing through the storm in his chest. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He, a man who commanded boardrooms with a glance, couldn't form a single word in front of the woman who once whispered his name like a prayer. He stepped closer, cautiously, as if the ground beneath them was fragile glass. His hand lifted on instinct, wanting to touch her, but her sharp inhale stopped him mid-air. "Don't," she whispered, her eyes filling but refusing to break. That refusal burned him more than tears would have. His gaze dropped to the baby, and the moment he saw those tiny hands curl, something inside him snapped. The little boy opened his eyes, and the room tilted. Those eyes, deep, dark, and fierce, mirrored his own. His breath caught, knees weakening as reality wrapped around him like a vice. This was his child, his blood, his legacy wrapped in a heartbeat. The baby's small cry echoed through the sterile room, and he stumbled a step forward, his hand gripping the rail of her bed for balance. Raina's hold on the baby tightened, protective and unyielding, like she'd already learned to stand alone in a world that once promised her forever. "Why are you here, Mr. Hope?" she asked softly, emphasizing his last name like a stranger's. He flinched at it. She hadn't called him by that name in years. He wanted to say he came because he loved her, because he never stopped, but the truth was messier. It lived in the space between his mistakes and her strength. He started, his voice hoarse, but she shook her head, silencing him without a sound. The baby whimpered again, and this time his tiny fingers brushed against her collarbone as if anchoring her to the only thing pure left in her world. The sight broke him. He had spent months convincing himself she'd moved on, that their love had died the night he walked away. But here she was, holding the proof of everything they once were, and everything he'd missed. Her tired eyes flickered down to the baby, then back up to him. "He doesn't need a father who chooses power over love," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but loud enough to echo through every corner of his soul. He stepped closer again, the storm outside rumbling like the night their world cracked. He wanted to reach for his son, to feel the warmth of the life he helped create, but her grip tightened, her stare daring him to take a step she wasn't ready to forgive. A nurse entered briefly to check the monitors, breaking the tension for a split second. "Congratulations," she murmured softly, unaware she'd walked into the ruins of a love story. Mr. Hope nodded weakly, but Raina's eyes never left his. There was strength in her silence, the kind that came from loving someone so deeply that it nearly destroyed her. He took a shaky breath, the weight of every missed moment pressing down on him. He thought the night he walked away was the worst pain he'd ever feel. He was wrong. This was worse. This was watching the woman he still loved cradle their child like a world he might never be part of again. "Raina," he whispered, her name falling from his lips like a confession. But before he could take another breath, the baby opened his eyes wider, blinking up at him with the exact same storm that lived in his own. It was like looking into a mirror he didn't deserve. The baby's tiny fingers reached toward him. And for the first time, Mr. Hope didn't know if he had the right to hold what was already his. The baby's tiny fingers hovered in the air like a fragile bridge between the past they destroyed and a future they didn't know how to build. Mr. Hope stood there, a man who had commanded entire empires with a single decision, yet now he couldn't decide whether to move an inch closer to the child who shared his blood. His heart thudded violently against his ribs. His breath caught halfway in his chest, as if his lungs were learning how to breathe for the first time. The soft glow from the hospital monitors washed over his sharp features, and for once, the power in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something raw, something that looked dangerously like fear. He slowly extended his trembling hand toward his son, every inch of movement weighted with regret. But just as his fingertips came close to the soft white blanket, Raina instinctively pulled the baby closer to her chest, shielding him from the man who had already broken her once. It wasn't hatred in her gesture, it was instinct, a mother's unshakable instinct to protect. Mr. Hope's hand froze in mid-air, fingers curling into a fist as he stepped back, the sting of rejection cutting deeper than any boardroom betrayal he had ever endured. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice rasped through the sterile room, cracking like glass under pressure. It wasn't the cold, controlled tone he used to control markets and men. This was the sound of a man standing at the edge of his own destruction. Raina's lips parted, her breath shaky, her lashes damp with tears. She had learned to cry in silence. "Because you stopped listening long before I stopped speaking," she whispered, each word heavy with months of sleepless nights, of carrying their child alone, of hearing her heartbeat sink with the tiny one inside her. His jaw clenched, guilt clawing its way up his throat like fire. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the past in his face. She just told the truth. And that truth shattered the version of himself he had built so carefully. He had thought walking away would make her safer. He had convinced himself that love made him weak. But standing here, watching her cradle the baby they created, he finally understood love had been the only thing that made him human. The baby let out a soft cry, not loud, not desperate, just enough to splinter the thick silence between them. Raina gently rocked him, her fingers brushing against his tiny curls with a tenderness that burned Mr. Hope from the inside out. That sound, that fragile sound, pulled him apart in ways he didn't think were possible. Every deal he had ever closed, every fortune he'd ever stacked, suddenly felt meaningless compared to that soft cry that belonged to him, and yet not to him. His knees almost buckled as he stared at the small, perfect face of his son. 1,000 images crashed through his mind, his first steps, his first words, birthdays he'd missed, laughter he hadn't heard, nights Raina must have cried alone. He wasn't there for any of it. He'd traded lullabies for silence, love for pride. The weight of that choice pressed down on him until it became hard to breathe. "I missed everything," he whispered, his voice breaking like a dam. His confession didn't ask for forgiveness. It was too late for that. It was the sound of a man finally facing his own emptiness. Raina's jaw tightened as she turned her face away, her arms tightening around the baby as though holding him was the only way to keep herself from crumbling. Her heartbeat steadied against the baby's tiny chest, their bond unshakable, untouchable. She had built an entire world around her son while he had built walls around himself. And now, standing on the outside of the world she created, he realized he might never be allowed in again. The monitors beeped softly, a rhythm that only made the silence heavier. He tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. All those nights when he lay awake in his penthouse, convincing himself she had moved on, he never imagined this, that she had built strength out of his absence. That their child had grown beneath the warmth of her love and not the shadow of his name. "Raina," he whispered, her name carrying every ounce of pain, love and regret he had buried for months. She finally turned her eyes toward him, and they weren't the same eyes he left behind that stormy night. They were stronger now, sharper, eyes that belonged to a woman who had learned to live without him. "Do you know what it's like," she said softly, "to love someone so much that even when they leave you to drown, you still teach yourself to breathe?" Her voice shook, but she didn't. She didn't need to shout to be heard. He swallowed hard, the back of his throat burning. He had power, money, fame, respect, everything except the one thing he had just realized he couldn't live without. Her, and the tiny life she now held. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say, the words sounding too small against the ocean of pain between them. Raina let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Sorry doesn't erase silence," she said. "Sorry doesn't hold my hand through contractions. Sorry doesn't wipe away the fear of giving birth alone." Each word was a lash of truth, leaving him standing bare in the ruins of his own making. The baby's tiny hand shifted against her chest, his fingers curling as if feeling the tension in the air. His soft breathing filled the room with something fragile, something achingly alive. Mr. Hope's gaze softened, but she noticed it. She noticed everything. "You think you can just walk back in?" she murmured, her eyes never leaving his face. "But where were you when I needed you most?" He had no answer. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything he should have said and didn't, everything she should have had and didn't. His heart clenched as he stepped closer again, but this time, slower, as if approaching something sacred. He knelt down, his powerful frame, folding before the woman he once thought he could live without. "Please," he whispered, "not a demand, a plea." Raina's breath trembled, but her arms didn't falter. She held her baby like a shield, like a promise. She looked at Mr. Hope as if weighing every tear she had shed, every night she had rocked herself to sleep, every heartbeat she had shared with the little life in her arms. And then, with a voice that was both fragile and fierce, she whispered something that turned the air to glass. She whispered a name. Not his name. Not Hope. The sound of it hit him like a blow, the syllables cutting through the walls of the empire he had built around himself. It was a name she had chosen alone, a name he hadn't been there to help pick, a name that belonged to her world, a world where he was a stranger. His chest constricted, his breath faltered, and for a brief, devastating second, the room tilted around him. His son didn't bear his name. Mr. Hope staggered back, his hand gripping the side of the hospital bed as the truth sank in. He was no longer the center of their story. The sound of that name still echoed in Mr. Hope's chest like a silent earthquake, the syllables tearing through the foundations of the world he thought he controlled. His fingers gripped the cold edge of the hospital bed as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing completely. Raina didn't look at him again. She sat quietly with their baby pressed against her chest, humming a lullaby in a voice so soft it wrapped the room like a fragile blanket. It wasn't his name. It wasn't his choice. It was her world, her decision, her power. And it stunned him to realize how much of it he had surrendered by simply not being there. The room was quiet except for the baby's tiny breaths and the slow, steady rhythm of the monitors. But inside him, a war raged between pride and pain, between the man he had been and the father he could have been. He felt like a stranger in his own story, like an outsider looking through the glass of a life that used to be his. His chest rose and fell unevenly as he forced himself to breathe through the ache clawing its way up his throat. He had built skyscrapers, crushed rivals, and ruled boardrooms, but nothing had ever felt this heavy, this suffocating. That night, he didn't leave. The rest of the world faded beyond those hospital walls, the flashing city lights, the ringing phones, the world that used to spin at the command of his voice. None of it mattered now. He stood outside her room as the hours bled into dawn, watching her through the glass window like a man desperate for a second chance at a life he'd carelessly thrown away. He saw the way she cradled their son, the soft sway of her body as she whispered words that were not meant for him to hear. Her eyes glowed with a love so fierce it scared him because it was a love he hadn't earned. Every breath their child took was a reminder of moments he'd never get back, of late-night feedings, of tiny kicks against her ribs, of whispered dreams she had spoken alone. His palms pressed flat against the cold glass, leaving faint imprints like invisible scars, and for the first time in his life, the mighty Mr. Hope felt small. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and loneliness, and the hum of machines played a cruel lullaby in the background. Nurses came and went. Time moved forward. But he stayed right there, rooted to the floor outside the room, like a man too broken to turn away but too afraid to step in. His pride had always been his armor, but now it felt like chains dragging him down. When morning came, the golden light filtered through the blinds and kissed Raina's tired face. Her hair was a little messy, her eyes a little red, but she was radiant, radiant with the strength of a woman who had carried love through pain. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not through the lens of control or expectation, but through the ache of everything he had missed. He thought about the night he walked away. He thought about the look in her eyes then, the silent breaking of something he didn't bother to hold together. He thought leaving would protect them both, but all he did was abandon her in the storm. Now that storm lived inside him. His throat tightened as he stepped closer to the door, every inch of movement slow, deliberate, as though the world itself might shatter if he made a sound. The door creaked open softly, and the scent of baby powder, warm blankets, and something achingly familiar rushed to greet him. Raina didn't look up immediately. She was sitting on the bed, her arms wrapped protectively around their son, whispering something only the two of them could share. Her fingers traced gentle circles on the baby's tiny back, her voice like silk brushing against his heart. He whispered the name, their son's name. It tasted strange and beautiful on his tongue, like a language he should have learned long ago. The moment the sound left his lips, his chest tightened, and something fragile cracked inside him. Raina froze, just for a heartbeat, then slowly turned her head, her eyes locking with his. There was no soft forgiveness there, only a quiet storm, the kind that builds without sound but shakes the earth when it finally breaks. He took a step forward, then another, his breath shallow, his heart pounding like a man walking toward his own reckoning. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, letting out a small sigh, and his tiny hand reached out as if sensing something, as if reaching for a piece of him he didn't even know how to offer. Mr. Hope knelt down beside the bed, the polished image of the powerful man stripped away until only a man remained, flawed, trembling, desperate. He extended his hand slowly, and this time Raina didn't move away, not fully. She watched him carefully, like a lioness protecting her cub, but she didn't stop him. His fingers brushed against the baby's tiny fist, warm and impossibly soft, and then those little fingers curled around his like it was the most natural thing in the world. His breath caught. Time held its breath too. For years he had thought power meant control. But now, looking down at the tiny hand gripping his, he realized power meant surrender. Surrendering to something greater than himself. His chest tightened, tears burned behind his eyes, and his throat ached from the weight of everything he'd never said. He wanted to say he was sorry, he wanted to promise he'd make it right, but the words felt too small, too fragile compared to the pain he'd caused. Instead, he just sat there, letting the weight of his son's tiny grip anchor him to something real for the first time in a long time. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they couldn't say yet, full of ghosts, promises, and a flicker of something that might one day be hope. Raina's gaze softened for just a second. Not enough to forgive, but enough to remember. Enough to feel the old warmth buried under all the pain. She had loved this man once, deeply. She had built dreams around him, and now, seeing him holding their child, a tear welled in the corner of her eye before she could stop it. She turned her head away quickly, wiping it before it could fall, but she couldn't stop the way her heart stuttered. He didn't notice the tear at first. He was too lost in the way his son's tiny breaths warmed his skin. But then she heard it, a soft, shaky exhale. Her exhale. He lifted his eyes to hers again, and for a fleeting heartbeat, something fragile hung in the air between them. But trust isn't built with a single touch. It doesn't return just because someone shows up. She turned her body slightly, creating a quiet barrier between them again, and the invisible wall he had once built with his own hands now stood in front of him, higher than ever. But this time, he didn't run. He stayed. He sat on the cold floor beside her bed, his fingers still tangled with his son's, letting the weight of the moment press against him like a lesson carved into his bones. He knew he couldn't undo the past. He knew forgiveness wasn't owed. But as his son's grip tightened, something inside him cracked open. Outside, the city buzzed with the noise of a world that no longer held his focus. Deals were being made, numbers rising and falling, but for Mr. Hope, none of it mattered anymore. His entire world was here, In this quiet room, in the warmth of the tiny hand holding his, in the silent tear she tried to hide. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something he didn't even know he could feel again. A father's awakening. A man stripped bare of everything except love. She turned away. But a tear slipped down her cheek when she saw him cradling their son. The silence after that tear fell hung between them like a fragile thread, delicate but unbroken. Mr. Hope sat on the cold hospital floor long after Raina turned her face away, his fingers still loosely wrapped around his son's tiny hand. The world outside the walls of that room shrinking until only the three of them existed. The tear she thought no one saw lingered in his mind like a spark refusing to fade. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A small, quiet crack in the armor she had built around her heart. And sometimes it's the smallest cracks that let the light in. When she was discharged, she didn't wait for him. Raina carried her baby to the car alone, her tired but steady steps echoing softly down the hospital corridor. The autumn wind kissed her cheeks when she stepped outside, carrying the scent of salt and ocean breeze from her little coastal town. She wrapped her son tighter in the soft blue blanket, her heart steady but cautious. She didn't look back. She didn't expect him to follow. But when the car door shut and the engine hummed, she saw him in the reflection of the side mirror, tall, silent, stripped of arrogance, standing in the fading afternoon light like a man who had nowhere else to go. Her little coastal house sat quietly on the edge of the shore, white walls kissed by years of salty winds, surrounded by weathered fences and blooming gardenias she'd planted with her own hands. It wasn't big, it wasn't luxurious, but it was home. It was where she had learned to be strong, where she had raised her child with lullabies and courage. She never thought Mr. Hope, the man who lived in towering glass buildings and counted the world in numbers, would stand in front of her little wooden door, his suit jacket gone, his eyes stripped of power, looking like someone who had finally learned what it meant to stay. She opened the door slowly, holding the baby against her chest, watching him from the threshold as the wind rustled through the garden. "You don't belong here," she said quietly, her voice not cruel, just real. He didn't argue. He didn't talk about boardrooms or mansions or things money could build. He just stood there, his jaw tense, his eyes full of something she wasn't sure she was ready to trust again. "I'm not here to take anything," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm here to learn how to be here." And for the first time in a long time, there was no arrogance in his words. Just a man standing outside the world he once broke, asking silently to be let in. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were real. He didn't move in. He didn't demand space. He simply showed up, every day, in the soft light of morning and the quiet of night. He knocked gently, sometimes with nothing but tired eyes and hands that had never known how to hold something this fragile before. At first, Raina let him in only for the baby's sake. She told herself that over and over, but then she began to notice the small ways he changed, the way he held their son like a fragile star, how he watched her with quiet respect instead of ownership, how he learned to listen more than he spoke. He fed their son with hands that once only signed contracts and held power. Awkward at first, spilling milk and fumbling with the bottle, but he didn't give up. Every time the baby cried at night, he showed up at her door, bleary-eyed and clumsy but present. He changed diapers with a seriousness that made her laugh more than once, though she tried to hide it. He learned the rhythm of midnight lullabies, the quiet language of rocking a child to sleep, and with each passing day, the distance between them softened, not erased, but softened like a scar, healing slowly. The baby's laughter became their bridge. It started as a soft giggle one morning when Mr. Hope tried to make silly faces, a sound so pure and bright it cracked through Raina's carefully guarded heart like sunlight through storm clouds. She hadn't heard their son laugh like that before. It was a sound built not from luxury or wealth, but from presence. Real, steady presence. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him hold their son, his hair messy, shirt wrinkled, face lit up with a kind of joy she'd never seen in him. For the first time, she saw not the man who left, but the man who stayed. But trust doesn't return in grand gestures. It hides in the quiet spaces between them. In the way he reached for the bottle without her asking, in the way she let him carry the baby without flinching, in the soft sound of shared silence on nights when exhaustion pulled them both down, but neither of them walked away. They built something fragile in those quiet moments. Not a fairy tale, something more human, more real. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes lingered on her like she was still the woman he'd once loved, but lost through his own hands. She noticed. She always noticed. But she didn't say anything. She didn't trust words anymore. She trusted what people did when no one was looking. And every time she saw him holding their son, whispering soft nonsense to make the baby smile, something in her chest shifted, slowly, like a door unlocking one hinge at a time. One late night, the house bathed in a soft golden glow from the single lamp in the corner. Their baby finally fell asleep, his tiny breaths even and soft against the quiet hum of the ocean outside. Raina sat on the edge of the couch, exhausted but calm, her hair loose around her shoulders. Mr. Hope walked in from the kitchen, holding the warm bottle they hadn't needed anymore. His sleeves were rolled up, and for once he didn't look like a man who ruled anything. He looked like a man who belonged in the warmth of a home. She reached for the blanket at the same moment he did. Their hands brushed, just skin against skin, brief but electric. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced, it just happened. And neither of them pulled away. Her breath caught for a second, the sound of the ocean filling the silence. His hand didn't tighten, but it didn't retreat either. His eyes lifted to hers, and in them she saw not promises but something quieter, more dangerous. Sincerity. Her pulse raced against her better judgment. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love reborn in a single touch. But it was something. The beginning of a possibility, and as the night wrapped around them like a soft tide, neither moved, neither spoke. The world outside faded into the sound of their child breathing in the other room, and the quiet thunder of two hearts remembering what it felt like to beat next to each other. One night, as the baby slept, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. 7. The brush of their hands lingered long after it ended, a quiet electricity running through the room like a secret neither of them dared to name. The golden light from the single lamp cast soft shadows across their faces, and for the first time in a long time, Raina didn't feel like she was standing on opposite sides of a wall. The house was wrapped in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. The kind of silence that breathes. Their baby slept soundly in the next room, his tiny breath steady and warm, while outside, the steady hum of the ocean filled the night like an old song that had always been there, waiting for them to listen again. Raina's fingers tingled where they had touched, her heartbeat uneven as she carefully stood up, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She walked toward the porch, the wooden floor creaking softly beneath her bare feet, every sound magnified by the stillness. The night air brushed against her skin like cool silk, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. Her hair danced in the breeze, falling softly around her face, catching the moonlight like threads of warmth woven through darkness. She leaned against the wooden railing and let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Behind her, the floor creaked again, softer this time, slower. She didn't turn around, but she knew it was him. Mr. Hope stepped onto the porch, his footsteps unsure but steady, like a man walking toward something fragile he didn't want to break. His presence wasn't loud, it wasn't demanding. It was quiet, patient, like the tide coming home to the shore. The night wrapped around them both, not as strangers anymore, but as two people who had once known the shape of each other's hearts. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The waves whispered against the sand, and the wind carried their unspoken thoughts between them. Raina closed her eyes, letting the night hold her, trying to decide if the warmth she felt was forgiveness or danger. She'd spent too many nights alone on this porch, watching the stars, whispering lullabies to her son, teaching herself how to breathe without him. And now he was here, standing just a few steps away, and suddenly every carefully built wall began to feel less solid. "Can you stay?" she whispered finally, her voice trembling with a softness she tried to mask. She didn't turn to look at him. Not yet. "Not because you're guilty," she continued, the words brushing the air like a fragile confession, "but because you still love me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, pulsing, alive with everything they had both buried. His breath caught. She heard it. She felt it. Mr. Hope stepped closer, the wood beneath his feet groaning softly in response. His heart pounded so hard it felt like the only sound in the world. He had spent years building a fortress out of power, control, and distance. But this woman, the one in front of him, wrapped in a shawl, framed by moonlight and ocean breeze, she was the only thing that had ever made him want to break down those walls. "I never stopped, Raina," he said, his voice rough and low, like it had traveled through storms to reach her. She turned slowly to face him, the shawl tightening around her shoulders as if to shield herself from the weight of his words. His eyes, usually sharp and guarded, were bare, stripped of pride, stripped of everything except the truth. "I just didn't know how to fight for you then," he continued, each word pulled from a place deeper than regret. "I do now." Her breath shuddered. For months, she had imagined what it would sound like if he ever came back. The apologies, the explanations, the promises. But nothing had prepared her for this raw, quiet honesty. His eyes didn't flicker away. He didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed in a moment. He simply stood there, letting his truth bleed into the night. The wind shifted, pushing a strand of hair across her face. He moved closer, slow, careful, like a man approaching something sacred. His hand lifted, trembling slightly, and when his fingers grazed her cheek, the world tilted back toward him. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't the rush of a fairy tale. It was warm, soft, and full of everything they hadn't said. Her skin tingled beneath his touch, and her heart stumbled against her ribs as if remembering something it had once known by heart. Her eyes fluttered closed. His palm rested against her cheek, not claiming, just holding, asking. And this time she didn't pull away. The distance between them dissolved slowly, like fog melting under the first light of dawn. The porch, the night, the waves, they all held their breath. And then, like the inevitable pull of the tide, she leaned into his touch. Their kiss came like a storm they'd both been holding back. Soft at first, almost trembling, as if afraid to shatter what they had rebuilt with quiet hands. But then it deepened, slow and burning, carrying months of silence, of unshed tears, of nights spent apart but still tethered by something neither of them could name. His hands slid to the back of her neck, her shawl slipping down slightly as her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. The world tilted around them, but neither cared. For that one breathless moment, nothing existed except the way his lips knew hers. The ocean roared softly beneath the stars, and the night seemed to press closer, wrapping them in a memory they were no longer running from. She tasted the warmth of him, the ache of everything lost, and the fragile hope of something returning. Her chest ached, not with pain, but with something dangerously close to love. When their lips parted, the air between them burned. His forehead rested against hers, breaths mingling in the cold night. Her eyes opened slowly, meeting his, and for the first time, She didn't see the man who left. She saw the man who stayed. "I want my family back," he whispered against her lips, his voice low and raw, a confession torn straight from his soul. As their lips parted, he whispered, "I want my family back." The night after their kiss felt different, not because the world had suddenly shifted, but because something fragile and real was quietly finding its place between them again. Raina woke to the soft cooing of their baby, sunlight pooling through the thin curtains of her small coastal home, casting gold across the worn wooden floorboards that once knew nothing but silence. But now there was laughter in the air. Mr. Hope stood in the kitchen barefoot, hair tousled, his sleeves rolled up, cradling their son with a clumsy tenderness that made her chest ache. He was whispering a lullaby under his breath, a man who once roared commands in boardrooms, now singing off-key to a tiny life he was terrified of losing. Raina leaned quietly against the doorway, her heart tightening with the ache of what they had lost, what they were slowly learning to rebuild, and what she was afraid to trust again. His voice cracked at the edges, his hands fumbled with the bottle, but the way his gaze softened when their son smiled at him felt like something stronger than apologies. It felt like a man learning to stay. When he turned and saw her watching, he froze, as if caught between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. She stepped in slowly, her bare feet sinking into the warm rug, her heartbeat steady but unsure. "You're getting good at that," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the ocean breeze that drifted in through the window. He looked at her like she was light. He wasn't sure he deserved to stand beneath. "I've had a good teacher," he whispered, nodding toward her, and then at their baby. "He doesn't let me get away with anything less than trying." Raina's breath caught at how easily his words slipped past her defenses now, not wrapped in charm or arrogance, but in quiet truth. She took their baby from his arms, their fingers brushing just long enough for her pulse to skip, for memories of a love she once clung to so fiercely to rise like old tides. The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin long after she stepped back. Days blurred into nights, and something unspoken began to weave between them. Mr. Hope no longer lived behind a wall of pride. He cancelled meetings without hesitation, left boardrooms unfinished, and ignored the blinking phone calls from empires that once owned his every second. Instead, he showed up at her doorstep every morning, not with roses or empty promises, but with groceries, diapers, and a quiet determination that startled her. He burned toast, spilled baby formula, and laughed when their son splashed juice all over his expensive shirt, but he didn't run. For the first time in their entire story, he stayed. Mini cliffhanger. Every time she tried to build distance, he found another way to silently show up. Raina found herself slowly, painfully, lowering the invisible wall she had built to protect herself. She watched him at dawn, when the world was still, their son asleep on his chest, his lips pressed gently against the baby's soft curls. He wasn't the man who once broke her heart with silence and absence. He was learning to be the man who whispered love in small, consistent ways. She caught herself laughing again in the kitchen, wiping flour from his cheek as they tried to bake cookies together, him failing miserably but smiling like he hadn't in years. He kissed the baby's tiny toes, made silly faces, and carried their little boy on his shoulders while Raina trailed behind, holding on to a hope she was afraid to name. She didn't know when she stopped watching him with guarded eyes and started watching him with a quiet longing. Evenings became a rhythm they hadn't planned. Shared dinners under dim lights, the sound of the ocean bleeding softly through the open windows, his deep voice humming songs to their son while she dried the dishes. Their love wasn't loud like it used to be. It was quieter now, more real, more raw. He sat with her on the porch, sometimes saying nothing at all, just watching the stars settle over the water. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow, patient stitching together of something once torn apart. And in those quiet nights, she began to realize, forgiveness wasn't a single decision. It was 100 tiny moments of choosing to let go of yesterday. mini cliffhanger. One night, as she tucked their baby in, she felt his arms brush against hers, and neither of them pulled away. The house that once felt too small suddenly felt warm, alive. He painted the porch railing with her, chased their son around the living room floor, and sat cross-legged with toys scattered between his knees. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pretending. He was becoming someone new, or maybe he was finally becoming the man he had always promised to be. Raina's heart struggled to keep up, torn between the ache of old wounds and the gentle pull of new beginnings. She caught him looking at her sometimes with that same soft gaze that used to undo her completely, and it terrified her how much she still felt it too. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the walls she'd built cracking in places she hadn't noticed before. But just when things felt steady, like maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to breathe in the same rhythm again, something changed. One evening after dinner, he kissed their son's forehead, whispered something against his tiny ear, and told Raina softly, "I'll be back in a little while." There was no explanation, just a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She thought nothing of it at first, but as the hours stretched longer, her chest began to tighten with a familiar ache she thought she'd outgrown. The clock ticked past midnight, and the sound of the ocean grew louder, colder, emptier. She paced the living room barefoot, the soft hum of the baby monitor the only sound besides her own quickening breath. She tried to silence the storm in her chest, telling herself people change, telling herself this was different now. But doubt, cruel and sharp, slipped through the cracks of trust like cold water. Where was he? Why hadn't he called? The night began to feel longer than it should, shadows growing deeper against the soft glow of the lamps. She ran her fingers along the baby's tiny hand, whispering, promises that steadied her, promises that if he broke this again, she wouldn't shatter with it this time. Just when she reached for her phone, a car door slammed outside. She rushed to the window, heart pounding like a drum she couldn't silence. Headlights cut through the fog of the coastal night, and she saw him, Mr. Hope, stepping out of the car with something hidden behind his back, his expression unreadable under the faint porch light. Her fingers tightened around the curtain, torn between wanting to open the door and wanting to lock it. His eyes lifted, and even from a distance, she saw the flicker of something in them, something that made the air between them thrum like a held breath. He walked toward the door with purpose, a shadowed box in his hand, and for the first time in weeks, Raina felt the past and the future collide at the threshold of her home. The moment the door opened, time seemed to fold in on itself, past and present, meeting on the small wooden porch of Raina's coastal home. The night air was damp with rain, the ocean wind carrying the scent of salt and second chances. Raina's fingers trembled on the door handle as golden candlelight flickered all around the porch, tiny flames standing bravely against the drizzle. She drew in a soft breath, her heart pounding so fiercely it felt like it might spill out of her chest. And there he was, Mr. Hope, the man who once left her shattered, standing in the rain, with water streaming down his hair and his once pristine shirt clinging to his chest. His hands shook as they held a small velvet box, but his eyes burned with the kind of truth no storm could drown. Her lips parted, not with anger this time, but with a silence so fragile it felt like the night itself was holding its breath. "I was a fool to let you go," he whispered, his voice unsteady yet firm, the words breaking through the soft drum of raindrops hitting the porch. "But I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'll never lose you again." He took a hesitant step forward, his shoes soaked, his heart laid bare in the open, like he had nothing left to hide behind. His empire didn't stand between them now, no polished suits, no boardroom arrogance, only a man who finally understood the weight of what he had almost lost forever. Raina's breath caught in her throat. For months, she had watched him change, not with words, but with small, steady actions. But this moment, This sight of him on her doorstep, with trembling hands and eyes that begged without pride, pierced deeper than any apology. The baby in her arms shifted slightly, his little fingers brushing against her jaw as if sensing the storm about to break. Her heart softened at the sound of their son's tiny laugh, a sound so innocent, so full of hope, it wrapped around the night like a promise. The candles flickered harder with the wind, but none of them went out. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, her thin nightdress brushing softly against her legs. The rain kissed her skin as she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man who once left, but the man who had chosen to return and stay. Every night of pain, every hour of doubt, every whispered prayer in the dark led here. "You broke me once," she finally whispered, her voice shaking like the ocean tide. "But somewhere in all that breaking you came back different." Mr. Hope swallowed hard, blinking through the rain. "I came back home," he answered, his voice cracking on the last word, his eyes fixed on the small face of their son. "Not because I deserve a second chance, but because loving you and him, it's the only thing I know is real." She could feel the walls she'd built start to crumble, not from pressure but from warmth. He slowly knelt down, the velvet box in his hand shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything this moment meant. The rain fell harder, soaking him completely, but he didn't care. He opened the box, revealing a simple ring, not lavish like the world he came from, but something quiet, elegant, and unshakably true. "Raina," he breathed, "I don't want to promise a perfect life. I want to promise to fight, to stay, to hold you when the world gets too loud. I want to wake up beside you and our son every day, knowing I finally got it right." Her vision blurred as tears mingled with raindrops on her cheeks. She didn't need diamonds. She needed what she saw in his eyes. Love, not the kind wrapped in words, but the kind that survived storms. Her knees weakened slightly, the baby's little hand resting against her neck as if anchoring her. She'd once dreamed of this moment, then convinced herself it would never come. And yet, here it was, not perfect, but real. The sound of the ocean swelled louder, as if the world itself was holding its breath for her answer. "Yes," she whispered. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, trembling, powerful. A single word that carried forgiveness, trust, and a future. His eyes widened. A breath he didn't know he was holding finally released into the rain. He rose slowly, closing the space between them until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her wet skin. He cupped her face with shaking hands, not claiming her, but holding her like she was the most fragile, precious thing he'd ever touched. The baby laughed again, a sound like sunlight in the middle of a storm, and then Mr. Hope kissed her, soft at first, as if asking for permission, then deeper, fiercer, like a man who finally understood the value of what he was holding. The rain poured down around them, soaking their skin, their clothes, their pain, their past. It was the same kind of rain that fell the night he walked away, only now it wasn't breaking anything, it was washing everything broken clean. She felt the years of ache melt beneath the heat of his lips, as if love had finally found its way home. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts trembling in perfect rhythm. The candles flickered, the wind swirled, and the rain turned their porch into a cathedral of soft light and quiet vows. Mr. Hope held the baby next, lifting their son carefully, reverently, as if holding the entire world in his arms. His voice was a whisper against the storm. This time, forever isn't just a word. Raina pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the wild, uneven thump of his heart. The same heart she had once loved, the same one that had broken hers, the same one now beating for both her and their child. Her tears were no longer from pain. They were from the kind of happiness that is born after a war is finally over. She leaned into him, Their son nestled between them, their 3 heartbeats falling into one soft, steady rhythm. The candles burned low as the storm wrapped around them, not as something to fear, but as something that made their embrace stronger. They stood there under the rain, no longer broken people reaching across a canyon, but a family. Whole, messy, real. His lips brushed against her temple and she closed her eyes. Under the rain, with their son in their arms, Mr. Hope whispered against her ear, "This time, forever isn't just a word." And in that moment, with the ocean roaring in the distance and the candles flickering softly, forever didn't feel like a promise they might break. It felt like home, and that, my beautiful family, was today's story. A journey of love, pain, second chances, and a bond that even storms couldn't break. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Beyond Color Stories for more powerful love stories that speak to the soul. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, because your words mean the world to me. Until next time, may love find you, may your heart stay strong, and may your story be unforgettable. See you in the next one. Stay blessed, stay loved.